Hey, it's Lindsay here, and we are going to get a little bit farther into our dissecting of why the bikes finished where they did in Shootout. This video is going to be all about the Suzuki RM-Z450, so I'm going to go through, give you some of the test driver's opinions, the characteristics of the bike, the positive and negatives, and ultimately tell you why it finished where it did in the Shootout. Before we get started though, I really quickly want to thank the brands that helped make this Shootout happen. We got a great amount of support getting all these bikes through Chaparral Motorsports. Check them out, shopmoto.com, if you need any parts, gear, accessory, etc. They've got a huge online shopping system there. Throw in the code ML512 at checkout to save yourself a few dollars at checkout. Also, Epoxy SoCal and DCMX tools, two local companies here in California that helped out support this thing a bit. Works Connection, Dunlop, Vista Designs, and then for all of our gear, Fox Racing and Oakley. Thanks huge part to those guys for allowing us to make this feature happen and be able to go through and give you guys this much information. So if you haven't checked out already, of course, we have the Shootout video. It's about 13 minutes long where I give you the quick ins and outs of these bikes and their overall ranking. But in this video, I'm going to take some time to go individually through this machine. I've also already uploaded a couple of these, so check them out in the description below, find the links for them. Like I said, this one's just all about the Suzuki, but I'm going to do one about every single bike individually. So ranking wise, no surprise, I feel bad saying that, I'll explain why in a second, but was last place. And with the 5 test drivers, it scored 6th place across the board. It wasn't really a surprise to anyone coming into this because quite a few of the guys I use in this shoot have done it with me before, and for the last 2 years, that is where this machine has placed since they've redone it in 18. It has finished pretty much last across the board. And we'll get into that. It's not that it is a bad motorcycle, and as I said at the top of pretty much every Shootout piece I do is, hey, the first place bike in this thing is not necessarily the bike we say that everybody has to go buy, and the last place bike is not the bike we're saying that nobody should touch with a 3-foot pole. There are reasons for each of these motorcycles, there are characteristics that could suit you, and reasons why this still actually might be the bike for you, so we'll get into that. So the reason I say we're not surprised though is with a lack of changes, really since it got changed in 18 to this generation of bike, it really is hard to move up the rankings. All they did from 18 and 19 was a couple clicker adjustments to the base. The base setting was still the same, just the base clicker positions was different, and that's it. So when everybody else around them is making changes, unless a bike is actually worse from their change, it's kind of hard to move below this thing in the Shootout. Because year over year, the opinions of the test drivers reflect the last year. They come back kind of with the same list of why they can't pick it any higher. And pretty much everybody comes back to the same thing, like, hey, I feel bad. It's not a bad motorcycle. It's just not really better in any individual aspect than anything else in the class. So it gives it hard to have this good reason that brings it up through the ranking and gives you a reason to, in your mind, go, oh, I think it should finish better than this, or this is why I feel, and this is why I like this characteristic, etc. But let's start with the good. Of course, everybody's going to go to it, the Suzuki. It turns better than anything in the class. It's a great handling motorcycle. That alone should do something for it. I think it depends how you weight the characteristic, because for me personally, this is not the best handling motorcycle in the group. And I said that about the 250 as well, as I don't think it's the best overall handling. When we talk about pure front-end bite, turn-in response, yes, the Suzuki has a big claim there. But because of other features and aspects of it, I don't think it's the overall best handling and turning motorcycle for me personally. Even though the bike did get a big overhaul in 18, it is still not that much different than what they had before. When they made this big change, they went all about the bodywork, which pretty much everybody agrees in the Shootout, most of us, that this is an amazing looking motorcycle. If we're talking about looks alone, Suzuki's way up there. They did a big chassis overhaul, but they didn't do a lot to the motor, and they really didn't do anything to lose weight. This is the only kickstart bike in the class, and it is the heaviest at a full weight of 248 pounds full of fuel. It's also kind of hard to say on the kickstart argument about weight when the only kickstart machine in the class is still the heaviest. And to that kickstart complaint, I already know few people are gonna say we're complaining about this, but notably every single rider is very disappointed that it doesn't have electric start. When you get used to riding everything else in the field like that, it is a little bit of a disappointment when you jump on this bike. Yeah, first thing in the morning, it is easy to roll over. When you are stopping and doing photo and video shoots all the time on them, and you're constantly shutting off the bike to talk to the photographer, it's hot, and it takes a long time to get it started as you kick it and kick it and kick it. You start to get that level of irritation. To the running joke, Adam Mentiknap did a really funny Instagram video where he said, hey, you wanna kick it with Suzuki as he fires it up? I may have made that joke a few times throughout the shootout. Nobody wanted to kick it with me. So, yeah. But talking about the characteristics of the motorcycle, like I said, that turn-in response is great. It has a fairly rigid chassis. It plants a lot of weight on the front end, and everybody did agree that this is probably the best bike in the class for that turn-in response. It does phenomenally well on flat corners. When there isn't really a rut or something to bank off of, that's where the Suzuki shines. That's where it actually has a characteristic that stands out that little bit. And guys come back and go, man, you know, I could get around that corner better than the other bikes, or this corner here or there. But a lot of sections where they couldn't. But the few it does, it stands out in. So it definitely has its direction in the way it was designed. But there's just the other things that we're going to get into that kind of take it out of the running. So positives, the turn-in. A lot of guys still like the ergos of the bike. Surprisingly, a lot of taller guys seem to like the ergos. I think the fact that the frame spars are still a little bit wider than some bikes in the class, the consistency of the bodywork, the places to grip onto the bike, and the balance between foot pegs, seat height, and bars, rider triangle wise, is definitely a decent size. It isn't necessarily bad for small guys, but definitely the taller guys in the class seem to have no complaints about this machine. I think the seat profile plays a lot into that. It feels a little bit taller on top. There's just things about it that definitely didn't have tall guys coming in saying they're cramped. So if you're that medium or taller height, the Suzuki kind of has something for it going out of the box there. As for the engine department, it does shine low to mid performance, even though this engine design is based off the original 08 version they did when they first went to fuel injection. It's had some minor tweaks over the year. It's still at the bottom of the class for pure output, but it has really good low to mid performance. It has a nice amount of response, and it has a good amount of pull out of the corner. It puts down the power well. Really what it comes down to is it's decently mapped and it has that response, but you definitely have to short shift it. It does not do well at high RPMs. It has still in the class the most old school 4-stroke feel of an engine. When you get it up to those high RPMs, you feel that engine inertia start to suck the bike down. And when it gets into the rev limiter, it gets into a harder and air bike and you feel it nose over. Speaking of that engine character, it just kind of comes from an overall heavier engine characteristic. And I feel that's part of what kind of also gives Suzuki that front end handling advantage that some people feel. That planted feels partially because when you chop to decel, this bike loads itself up on the front end a lot more than current bikes. As some guys have gotten to more freer engines, as some of the OEMs have tried to free up that feel, it does improve corner roll in character because the engine is freer, allows you to coast in and the bike gets less upset. But at the same time, sometimes you lose that maximum traction because the motor isn't loading the chassis and loading the front end is same. That's also something that kind of plays into the Suzuki's comfort. Every person who rode this came and go, man, it's just a little bit rigid everywhere. It's just not that comfortable compared to anything else in the class, and everybody just feels like it takes more energy to ride than anything else. And part is that it has a very rigid chassis. You have that engine decel forcing the front end down, and it's just putting a lot of effort and a lot of workload on the forks. So the forks are interesting to dial in. I don't think the setting is necessarily bad. It's pretty close to what the Honda 450 comes with. And honestly, it's probably got better oil volume than what's in the KX 450 with the same style fork. It's just the fact that the chassis is taking up but producing so much energy that has to deal with in you as the rider as well. So like I said, those tight little corners, no ruts and stuff, Suzuki shines. When you get it into something that's more of a medium terrain, still hard pack, ruts have chop in it, it's just hard to get the Suzuki to stay planted. It feels very harsh. You feel all the bumps on acceleration, on decel, and it makes it hard to want to charge into the corners late in the day. When the track's smooth in the morning, it's great, but late in the day, you just know it's gonna take a lot out of your body to push deep into the corner because so much of the energy is transferred to the rider itself. Because of the stiffness of the chassis though, the loamier the conditions you can find, if you can find some nice sand berms and stuff, it feels very precise in those situations. It's easy to carve into and start to pull out of the berm when you want to, or you can leave it and follow in. It has a good amount of response that doesn't take much effort on your part to make those corrections. So it is an interesting bike because it can change direction fairly quickly. It's just down to what the terrain looks like and how much energy it's going to take out of you to pull that off. The other major point of contention is the Frc Shock. Being that hasn't been very well accepted since it came out, and there hasn't been a major change to it, it's kind of hard to describe what to do. It's a very interesting shock. It's based off road race technology. In my personal opinion, I don't think it handles high-speed loads the best. It's the only shock in the class I was personally afraid to seat mount stuff on. I ran into this last year, nearly endoing on a track that has a certain steep jump face. I could seat mounts the jump on basically any other bike in the class, but this one would constantly blow through the stroke and have that consequence of endoing afterwards as that energy is released. And still going into this test, we found that quite often. The problem is you don't want to go a lot stiffer on compression on the shock because it just tends to ride high in the stroke. It has that stink bug feel. It's hard to keep the bike balance while getting the shock in the right realm it needs to be. It does work fairly well on really chattery style chop, although I said you feel it. That's more because of the chassis. The shock itself has a very free feel for rebound, a very free, I would say, middle stroke characteristic. So it does settle quickly into little square edge chop like that. So you're getting that constant connection with the rear wheels. So there is a positive with the shock design there. I just feel like it's a shock that works in a narrower window than most traditional designs. I don't think it works particularly well on high-speed hits, and I don't think it works in some of the most low-speed situations, but it has this middle ground where it definitely shines. As for the bike balance, it seemed like most guys in the class were focusing, or most of the guys in this test were focused on running the sag 105 and more. I think I personally ended up at 108. Most of the guys were in that 106, 107 range. Try to get rid of the stink bug character just a little bit on this bike. And try to balance out a little bit more. And then fork setting totally came upon what you were looking for. For me, because there is so much harshness at the front end of the bike, I try to soften it, but then it'll dive a lot. So I'm going softer plus faster on rebound. It ends up moving a lot, or maybe some people call the bike teeters a lot because you're getting a lot of forward aft motion. But for me, it's one of the only ways I can get the fork comfortable enough to want to charge into something. Basically, I'm giving up a level field with the bike. I'm giving up that balance and letting the bike move a lot more, but to try to get some fork action going and get some comfort back out of the bike. Like I said, the engine is capable in a way. It's that low to mid performance. If you short shift it, you can keep up with most bikes, and it depends on the size of the track. Ultimately, a couple guys commented as well that the gearing feels a little bit tight in the bike. So those short shifts, you are getting gear to gear really well, but you start to realize you're rowing through the gears quicker, especially on a really open, high speed track. Second and third feel very competitive with the other bike. It's once you get to fourth, going from 3 to 4, you start to realize you're losing output on other machines. So really big open straightaways, really big hills, you can start to feel the other bikes just are gonna get away from this machine. Talking a little bit about some of our test riders' opinions, we're gonna start with a couple notes that Jeff Walker sent me over. Goods for him. That bottom end, that response, that low to mid, as long as you shift it, was really good for him. He also noted, yes, it corners really well on flat, smooth corners. The front end sticks well and rarely washes. Said there was a lot of confidence on the front end because unlike some air bikes in the class, he didn't find places where it would want to wash or push out as easy. Chassis stiffness does feel good in loamy or sandy sections. Once again, it feels very precise when the material is loose. Gives you some confidence in the bike there. For him, even at his size, ergonomics are really comfortable. Sitting on the bike while not riding, saying about how stiff it felt in motion, but while sitting on it, everything feels great. Everything feels like it's in the right place. The bad. The top end is lacking. The rev limiter has that old school feel, aka super violent. She doesn't like to be revved. That was Jeff's exact note. Suspension and chassis stiffness feels horrible on hard packed jumps. Nearly impossible to charge into rough corners. The seat, although the curve is good, is super slippery. I'm not sure if something happened mid-test, but we had a couple guys comment compared to a lot of our bikes in the class that they just found themselves sliding forward. And I noticed it mostly from the midpoint forward. As I would brake, I'd find myself just sliding forward on the bike. And honestly, I didn't use any unique cleaners on the machine. I pretty much just use standard Dawn soap wash and water. Didn't use anything unique because I try to keep away from anything happening in that sense. No SC1, no cleaners for the plastic, etc. A comment on the overall quality of some of the parts felt low. The throttle cable slack adjuster stripped out immediately. Commented about not liking the kickstart and heavy. And that's an interesting one because guys always talk about the weight of the bikes, and some people I think get mad when we say, oh, a heavy bike doesn't feel that light. Now, I will admit this is a caveat of testing on West Coast tracks. I believe that the loamier the dirt you ride in, the softer the material as you get back east, I think the physical weight difference of a bike becomes more apparent because I feel like saying you're moving around on the bike more, you're doing a lot more physical work, and you start to feel that lack of weight when you're actually having to muscle it around. West Coast, though, having tracks that roll more in the corners that are a little more hard pack on entry where we don't have as much traction, I feel like a lot of the bikes here, we carry and roll our momentum a bit different. And because of that, as long as all the weight is balanced center on the bike and it doesn't dive or change directions a lot, it's hard to feel some of those weight differences because you're not having to manhandle it or force the bike to do as many things. In this case though, mostly because of the engine braking, the bike does feel heavy in certain situations because that engine is pulling it down and it's making you work against it at times. So a few riders came in and mentioned that this one definitely feels like it's the heaviest in the class. It's only about 1.5 pounds heavier than the Yamaha in physical weight, but there feels like there's a pretty big difference between those two when you actually ride it. Another one of our riders, B rider, Maddox Soto, about 5'10", high 160 pound weight. He actually personally rides a Suzuki 250 right now, so he said ergonomically, super comfortable on the bike initially. Did like the low to mid power. He likes short shifting the 450, so he said the output was really good, but same comment as Airbells, you know, the more you ride it, it's interesting. If you put out a good long moto on it, you start to come and go, you start to get used to where it's stiff and you try to work around that and you come and go, man, it's not that bad. Like it's better than I think it is. And then you jump on one of the machines with more comfort afterwards, which is, like I said, almost anything in the class. And then those things become more apparent, you know, what you were dealing with and where it was eating energy out of you. Another one, Zach Petty, the smallest guy in our group, also kind of that pro-ish level up there with Jeff, like in Supercross, doing some outdoor nationals as well. He's the smallest guy in the group. He said he knows that physical tiring of the bike the most. He said to put in laps on it just ate up the most energy. Did like the overall balance of the machine, just the harshness was the biggest thing, and just as you spin the motos, I feel like personally, you feel a lot of that energy, especially in the upper body. When I ride it, I just notice like shoulder fatigue, upper back wear a lot quicker because of the energy coming up through the bike. I mean, the way you stand is a big difference, but it's mostly this upper body. It's dealing with some of that shock. That's where I start to feel the wear when I ride. So a few people always comment like, well, do you guys weigh price into Shootout? The bike's really cheap. This bike was. This is actually a 2019. I said that at the opening of the Air Shootout videos because the 2020 had a line graphics change, and I think the triple clamp color might be different, and that's it. So in my case of buying the bikes, yeah, I went and bought a 19 because there was a nice big rebate on it, and it was by far the cheapest motorcycle in the class. The one thing Suzuki doesn't really do itself a favor on is while they're giving out these great rebates, I think it makes the bike a great price point item, especially when you look at the budget of like, hey, if you can get this thing for $3,500, almost $4,000 cheaper than like a KTM, is a second or two a lap worth $4,000 to you? Is it going to put that much of a bigger smile on your face? That's something to weigh in, but that's after the fact. That's a year-old model with a really big rebate. Coming into 20, they have released the bikes. This last week, I believe they've hit dealerships, and they're going to have a rebate on them, but they still announced the bike with an MSRP that is only around $100 or $200 cheaper than the next bike in the class. So if you weigh it based off the MSRP, it's not that much of a bargain. If you weigh it based off the rebates, yes, it's a really good price point bike, and I kind of just wish they would lead into the year with that, especially if they're going to drop rebates right when the bike comes out and they're prepared to do that. It would be a lot easier from a media sense to kind of target the bike with that price in mind if that's what they were leading with, because yeah, if you have that big of a deficit, there's a lot of things you can do to that bike, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now is some of the things I would do to the bike if I were actually going to keep this one. A lot of them aren't that expensive. Naturally, yes, I would have the suspension revalved. Race Tech has a really great kit for the Frc Shock where they redo the whole valves itself. There's some really good gains that can be made there. If you have a little bit more budget, just changing the entire shock out is a great option. There is Showa, KYB, Ohlins kit shocks, WPs. There's even a shock that my partner in Works Chassis Lab made where we take a KTM upper body and put older Suzuki bottom guts in it. Those are really good as well. You'll see a few race teams run that where it looks like they have an older KTM shock on. That's why like some of the teams in Europe and stuff that aren't as much of a budget to go and get Showa kit stuff for doing that. But just even a revalve is with the proper components and kind of redoing the valves in the BFRC shock can be a huge help. Trying to get some chassis comfort out of it is really big. I've mentioned a few times on this channel, me and a partner have a company called Works Chassis Lab. We do the engine mounts for a big chunk of factory race teams, Star Racing, Kawasaki, Sierra Honda, Hep Suzuki, Admec, Nap help us do a bunch. They're not on this bike, of course, because it's our stock bike. But getting a little bit more flex out of the chassis, running engine mounts to allow the chassis to move more against the engine, helps take some of that rigidity out of the overall characteristic of the bike. They're a pretty cheap upgrade. That's something I would really recommend. Also, just an ECU, whether it's an ECU reflash or full vortex is huge on this bike, because being able to adjust the power character and try to get rid of some of that engine braking and free up the motor through mapping and try to spread the power a little bit better is really big on this bike, taking what's already here and trying to get the best out of it. Because like I said, freeing up the engine character also frees up a bit of the bind on the chassis and makes it more comfortable. Tires, I was really not a big fan of the Bridgestone. I think it's the Battlecross 40 that comes on them stock. We swapped everything to MX-33s this year because Dunlop supported the Shootout and was able to get us a bunch of fresh tires to keep everything, you know, just fresh on the bike throughout the whole test. That alone was a big help. I really didn't like the front Bridgestone tire. It was such an aggressive sidewall that I felt like the bike just wanted to climb out of the ruts the whole time. This actually made cornering a lot easier, in my opinion, up at the front end. So definitely a little bit better set of tires, in my opinion, is a really big help. And just working as usual ergo stuff. So if I had to tell somebody, hey, what would I expect to spend the money on? Free up the chassis a little bit. ECU pipe is huge on this bike. Definitely can get you the gains to put you where the other bikes are stock in the motor department. Suspension's the biggest one though. Just getting it revalved, just getting it properly done by somebody that's got some good knowledge and has dealt with the BFRC shock a lot will put you way in the correct direction. So yeah, if you're able to pick up one of these at a big discount, if you can get this thing for $3,500, $4,000 out the door cheaper than the highest end of the class, once again the KTM or the Husky, or still even $2,500 or $3,000 under a lot of the other Japanese bikes, you could take, I would say safely take $1,800 of that. Cheap pipe, stainless system. Yoshimura works really good on this bike. Of course, they have a lot of development with the team. Engine mounts, remap it, good suspension. Yeah, you're gonna have a pretty good motorcycle for the bang for your buck. It's still gonna have a few characteristics I don't necessarily agree with, but if you like what we're talking about with the rest of the bike, then yes, you can manage that, you can expand upon that and try to just get it a little bit more rounded for the rest of the situations. So if you like this content, please hit subscribe, hit the little bell notifications. I'll be doing more videos on the rest of these bikes individually. Like I said, this is just the Suzuki one. We've already got one up on the Yamaha, got a few others dropping, and the overall Shootout. So check out all that content. If you like Shootouts, if you're looking to actually buy a 450 this year, that's why we're going through and doing all this content to try to give you guys as much information as possible about these machines if you're really looking to go spend your hard-earned money.